Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the Facts and Fallacies podcast. Excited to be with you as always. My name is Cameron English. That's Dr. Liza Dunn.
Hi, how are you?
I'm terrific.
Long
Very
time no
excited to
see.
be here. I know it's been almost a week
Yeah.
because things have been crazy. So we've been knocked off our routine, but we're back. We're here. We're going to do it. Looking forward to it. No stories this week. We're going to delve into a topic that it's always in the news, but especially since the Make America Healthy Again trope has taken off. We're seeing a lot more of this. It's been ramped up, and it's never really probed in detail. And we want to do that. So I don't think the people that are making these claims that we're going to talk about are going to listen to this, but I think you listeners, viewers, dear friends of ours, you will interact with these people. And when they say this stuff, you go, Liza and Cam got this. Okay. So this is what we want to talk about, of course, is this idea that the regulatory agencies, it applies to any country really, but especially in the U.S., the idea that FDA and EPA and these other agencies are owned or controlled by industry. It's a very massive topic. We're not going to get into everything, but there's some highlights we can hit that you're going to hear all the time. And of course, Liza works in the pharmaceutical industry, and she was a doctor for a long time, being on the other side of the issue, so to speak. And I've done some work on this as well. So I think there's some things that we can get into that a lot of people don't know that would be helpful. So the reason I wanted to jump into this in particular is I was scrolling through Netflix a while back before I canceled my subscription, and I landed on a preview for some, big conspiracy show. And there was this reenactment, and it's in like the boardroom of a pharmaceutical company, and the lights are dimmed, and they're not smoking because smoking is unsexy these days. But like the implication is like these really powerful men are talking about bad things, and one of them they're talking about how they're going to get this drug or something on the market that's really dangerous, right? That's implied.
Oh gosh.
And then one of them, who presumably is going to go on to be the whistleblower, says, "But this is dangerous. We can't do this. What about ethics?" Da, 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 da. And the other guy goes, "Well, since the FDA lets us regulate ourselves, that won't be a problem." And it's like,
That's ridiculous.
oh my gosh, it's just like
That's
a head slapping moment. I can't, I don't know if like people in Hollywood really believe that,
I
or
think
if
they do. I think
they
they do.
they must like, or they're so cynical. I don't know. Maybe it's a mix. I don't know. But in any case, maybe we could just start there with this idea of the FDA being owned by industry. What are your thoughts on that?
So first of all, the FDA is absolutely not owned by industry, and really is there to assure the public that their safety is intact. The role of government agencies like the FDA and EPA is to make sure that companies are following the rules for developing products that will, one, be beneficial for people, and two, not harm people or the environment. And so there is a very rigorous process that one has to go through to get that done. So let's say you're a pharmaceutical company, and you have a person in academia that has a brilliant idea that they've been able to do some preliminary work on it, something that's going to cure cancer, right? Some big, thing. You will look, the universities are not in a position to do all of the regulatory work that it takes to get that idea off this lab shelf in the university all the way out to the public, because that's a very rigorous affair that is heavily regulated by the FDA. So you'll have a researcher, sometimes at a university or sometimes in a company itself, with this idea. The company says this is a great idea. Let's do some testing, and they will do a battery of tests that will demonstrate whether or not there is efficacy. So does this work from a mechanistic point of view? Does it seem like this is a good idea? And then they will go and look at in cells. Does this seem to work well in a cell? In a cell situation, like in a petri dish kind of thing, and then they will go, if those things look promising, then they'll go test them in animals, and then eventually they will sort of winnow down the number of chemicals that they are being aimed at this particular problem and get some candidate molecules that they think are the most promising. Once they've got demonstration of safety in this setting, then they'll bring it into a phase 1 trial where they'll test for efficacy and safety in people in healthy volunteers. Then they'll expand it to phase 2 and phase 3, and then these are randomized, controlled, double-blind studies to demonstrate whether or not there's a benefit of these drugs. This whole process, which I just encapsulated in a very, very short, small amount of time, takes 10 or 15 years to do and costs at least $1 billion. And the tests that you're doing have to be done under very strict rules. So the regulatory agencies will design the protocols that you need in these early phase studies, very, very early phase studies. In order to be able to ensure that the results are, the study methods are validated and that the results are reproducible, you've got to ensure that happens first. And when you do those in the lab, those are called under good laboratory practice. And once you've done those in the lab setting and shown some benefit in the lab setting, then you are able to, and this includes cellular studies and animal studies and things like that. Then you're able to move into people, and then so what that involves is you have to then scale up the amount of the product that you're working on to be able to supply enough of that product to the groups of people, which as the studies increase, you're getting bigger and bigger groups of people being tested, right? So you have to build up enough product to do that, and that needs to be done under good management or manufacturing processes. So you have very strict rules and regulations about how these drugs need to be manufactured, and make sure that they're not contaminated, make sure that the dose is correct. All of these kinds of things go into that as well. So it is a multi-year process that is heavily regulated, that is auditable, and often you have failure at the end. So it's a highly risky $1 billion spent and then not without a product at the end. So in order to get very good research and development going, it's a costly proposition, and universities are not in the position to do that. And taxpayers shouldn't be on the hook for paying for that either, because the company is going to be making the profit from the pharmaceutical. But the company needs to be able to make enough money to pay back for all of that cost. So where the FDA comes in this picture is once they've got this new drug application and they're able to demonstrate the basics of the mechanism of action and the whole kind of animal studies and things like that, the FDA then gets involved in making sure that these studies are conducted properly and that the outcomes of the studies are properly reported, and any adverse effects are recorded and reported as well. So since this is a very arduous process, it takes a lot of time. If you are somebody that's got a disease that doesn't afford you a lot of time in terms of life expectancy, so some cancers in the 80s, with the whole HIV epidemic, you had people with a very short lifespans when HIV first made its appearance on the scene. So there was a lot of pressure on FDA to be able to expedite these processes. And so what pharmaceutical companies did in order to try to help that along was they got together and put together a fund so that FDA could hire more scientists to help review this backlog of drugs in order to get them on the market faster to save more lives. No good deed goes unpunished because the thought that what the popular press
They're all
claims
owned. They're all
is
owned.
that they're all owned. But really, and I think the culmination of this really wound up paying off during Operation Warp Speed, where you actually um, you had the high quality studies that had gone on for decades before the mRNA vaccine was truly established, but they served the backbone, and so a lot of the they served as the backbone for developing this, and you were able to cut time off from the regulatory studies that that are done for ordinary drugs. And that doesn't mean that these regulatory studies weren't done. It was just that you were able to use the historical studies in a lot more efficient manner to establish safety and efficacy, and expediting that could in for other drugs, particularly cancer drugs, could really save lives if people were to have a little bit more faith in the integrity of this program.
All very good points. There's some interesting things that come to mind based on that overview you gave. One of them is that people that go into industry, like if you're a scientist and you go work for a pharma company, you're trained at a major university, right? And you can speak to
Yeah.
this too, but these companies recruit out of reputable schools, right? They go
Yep.
look for the cream of the crop in the sciences to work on new drugs. If you know anything about universities in the West, they are hardly bastions of capitalist rhetoric
That's right.
and love of industry, right? Right? They're not going and finding a bunch of mini Milton Friedmans to come into these companies, right? These are
No.
most people, in my experience anyway, most of the scientists that are on the scene talking about this or working in these fields, they're not like radical right wing ideologues, you know?
No, they're
So,
not.
so I think in many cases, you're getting people that work at these industries that actually appreciate the value of having regulatory oversight.
Yes.
And people will mock this too, but one of the ways you can see that is that people from industry will go work at FDA or vice versa, right? They'll leave the regulatory agency and they'll go work for a company because the company wants help getting through the review process.
That's right.
Now there could be bad there. I'm not saying that. There are instances where I think there's untoward things going on, but as a rule, the people that are developing these drugs are not anti-regulatory ideologues.
Not at all.
Very
People,
important.
yeah, these scientists aren't going in. These scientists are going in with the idea that what they're doing is actually helping mitigate suffering, right? They don't want people to be sick. They are creating products that help people's quality of life improve, and that's why they go into this. And so they study this. They study this at the university, and then they realize that often at the university it's much harder to get their idea off the off and out into the public. And so what they do is they go to industry to try to help develop that, and then they develop real expertise. And not to say that they're not experts when they're at the university, but they learn about how the regulatory process works when they're working for a company. After that, if you go to FDA, you then are also offering the government some personal expertise when you go to these organizations, right? Because you've been through the process, you understand the process, you understand the rules, and that not very many people, not very many scientists and universities understand those rules. Likewise, when you come from FDA and you are working at a company, you can advise that company on what the rules are and how to follow them, and what what they need to look out for when they are developing a new product. And so the reason why there's an exchange there is because there's real expertise that's developed, and that expertise is necessary as a cross kind of pollination thing. It's not necessarily, oh, we want to try to just get this on the market willy nilly, and we've got a back door to that. That's not the case.
Yeah.
There,
Just a couple of things. I want to stick a disclaimer in here that I really genuinely mean because I want people to, I don't want people to think that we're just excusing bad behavior.
yeah.
So if you have instances where you have a regulator that, say, rigs the regulatory process or misleads the public about certain data related to a drug, or a company that does that, I think there needs to be very harsh penalties, right? So
Yes. Yes.
depending on the degree of harm that your malfeasance does, I wouldn't take jail time off the table. And at the very least, being fired and never being allowed to work in the pharma industry or in the regulatory apparatus ever again. Because that's the sort of stuff that jeopardizes the public's trust. So, for example, the FDA's center that regulates nicotine products, the leadership was all just fired, and they all deserve it. They're just awful, miserable people that have allowed politics to influence what they do. So they were all fired, and the head guy was offered a job at the Indian Health Bureau, or the Bureau of Indian Health Affairs or something. I
Oh,
forget what it's called,
interesting.
in rural Alaska, right? So I don't understand all the details that went into this, but whoever was reviewing that department at FDA said, okay, this guy's gone. So I think that's actually a good example of the kind of justice that could be done. Because, and I've talked about the nicotine space before, but you have a process that's designed to punish the smaller companies that can't compete with the bigger ones. You have manipulation of data, you have denial of very clear evidence, and so good riddance, right? Now, if you can show that in some other at some other agency or some other department, then by all means, fire the people that did that, punish anyone in industry, or by the way, any NGO that's involved, and maybe that's a topic we can turn to
Yeah.
as well. Is that the people that,
Or
yeah, go ahead.
academics that fabricate the research that
Yes,
then launches an avenue of study that has gone that goes to that goes through the whole regulatory process, and then is and it's and has multiple millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, of taxpayer funding. And I'm thinking about some of these publications that with amyloid beta, right? If there is, if you need to be held responsible if you fraudulently publish papers that are then propagated through the literature and propagate and held up all the way through this all the way through the studies. Um,
and
and
this is
drug
related
development.
to Alzheimer's research, right? Just so
Yeah.
people, yeah, okay. So there's been billions of dollars at this point spent on clinical trials for drug prospects that are just dead ends. They're just shams because the data was bad. Is that right?
And the data originated in academia and then was propagated through academia. Other avenues of investigation were shut down, as far as I understand. So it's not just academia's got an interest in keeping their studies funded, right, as well. So everybody's got their own interest in this, and academia is not immune from fraud, and so that should be pursued in that direction as well.
All of it needs to be corrected, punished, however you want to put it. But what's interesting to me is that the people that will complain about industry influence on the regulatory space, um, or just an overwhelming influence on people's health decisions, they don't care as much, or maybe not even at all, when other interest groups do that. So, for example, if there's an environmental group, we'll call it the Center for Puppies and Green Spaces, just to make sure I'm not naming anybody, right? You have these very influential NGOs that have a lot of money behind them. Dr. David Zarek has talked a lot about this. You have these very wealthy foundations just pumping rivers of cash into these environmental NGOs and other groups. And oftentimes they're staffed with people at these regulatory agencies, which should give you another clue, right? If somebody
Mm-hmm.
leaves the FDA or the EPA and they go to whatever I call it, the Center for Puppies and Green Spaces, right? If they go to some very fringe environmental group or public health group, what does that tell you about their priorities? It tells you that they're not there doing the bidding of Pfizer,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
So you need to be aware of that for one thing. But the other thing is that a lot of these groups, what they do is they will go back to the regulatory agencies and they'll do things you're allowed to do. Anyone can do this, right? They'll file a citizen petition and they'll say, we want you to ban this chemical because it causes people's middle fingers to fall off. And that's just whatever, right? It doesn't have to be true, but they will submit thousands of pages or hundreds of pages of documentation and argument, blah, blah, blah. And by law, the agencies have to review all that and then make a determination about whether or not they're going to act upon it. So
Right.
that takes resources, that takes time. It's a waste of what the agencies are meant for, which is to review the safety of chemicals that aren't on
Right.
the market yet, right? So, and that's the other thing I should add. These petitions or the lawsuits that are filed, they're all aimed at things that are already on the market, usually.
Yes.
So you know, like BPA, right? That's been on the
Yes.
market forever. It's been
Forever.
studied
And
to
it's been
death.
studied to death. Most recently, I want to say the Clarivity study. I can't remember what the
It's
exact name of it.
2018, I think, and it was
That got published in 2021. And it was
okay.
a multi-institutional study where they looked at different claims being made about BPA and taxpayer expense. And once again, we're dumping taxpayer dollars into so many things that we know the answers to, and because of these petitions, and it really takes up resources. Really takes up resources, and claims like BPA is an endocrine disruptor are just not true. It's not true. But what it's done is it's not only launched a bunch of investigative studies reviewing what we already know and that we've known for decades and decades and decades. It's also made companies reformulate all sorts of stuff in order to address this concern. And even if there's no health effect. And so, where does that cost go? That goes into higher taxes for the taxpayer and higher costs for the consumer. And then these same groups of NGOs wind up going to the next product that the company has manufactured in response to these groups and says, well, we don't know enough about this one. You got to take this one out. So the amount of BPA that children are exposed to in this day and age is minuscule because it's been taken out of everything. But the same concerns, even though these things have been thoroughly tested, the same concerns are being raised by the same groups. And so it's wash, rinse, repeat. And it does not benefit the taxpayer. It does not benefit the government, because the government is busy being distracted by things they shouldn't be distracted by. And then that requires more, manpower. And requiring more manpower requires more money. And if pharmaceutical companies donate that money, then they're accused of biasing the process.
And another thing too is that it, as you said, it shifts the priorities, but then I think that attracts attention of bad actors, right? So if you, for example, are like a true ideologue, like you're just a dyed-in-the-wool environmentalist, you hate industry. If you're in college and you start studying toxicology or something, whatever, and then you see that EPA is wasting all its time on this, what are you going to do? You're like, well, I should go there because that's what I want to do. Is I want to waste. They won't put it this way, right?
Yeah.
But I want to grind industry into the ground because I don't like them, right? So it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's a real problem too. But to return to the drug review process, because you made some really good points, but to the idea that industry owns this process, there's a couple different references here. I can give these if people want. But as you said, the process can cost multiple billions of dollars to get a single drug approved and on the market through the FDA process. And I think it's like a decade or something on
Mm-hmm.
average. It's a massive commitment. But the other thing, and this is from the FDA itself, about 10 to 12% of drugs that begin the development process actually make it to market. So the questions I have for people that push this, pharma owns the FDA thing. If they own the process, why would 12% of the drugs that they start to
Right.
develop be approved, right? Wouldn't they just rubber stamp almost everything? And why would it be so expensive? Wouldn't they want it to be cheaper if they could? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so and that's a really good point. And the other thing is that sometimes when a drug goes on the market, a signal is picked up. You follow those drugs afterwards. There was a drug on the market when I was a fellow called telithromycin. It was a new antibiotic. Everybody was really excited because it was a new antibiotic on the scene. It wound up causing some problems that were picked up in post marketing surveillance, and so it got removed from the market. So not all of that 10%, and I think it's even I think it's even lower than 10%. Not all of that 10% actually makes it even past launch. So and companies are interested in want to make sure that what they're getting to patients is safe. I've heard people. I've actually had conversations with people. I'm like, do you really think that have made claims that companies are all in it for the bottom line. And I'm like, do you really think that my colleagues that I work with every day go into work and say, I want to develop something that's going to harm a patient, that's a good business plan? No, they don't do that. They don't do that. Um, and and so the people that I've been talking to about that, they're like, well, your business guys do that. No, they don't do that. They aren't. They they don't purposely go out to develop something to harm people. They are very committed to inventing incredible technologies to deal with some of the biggest challenges in human health that the supplement industry is not going to have.
Very good points. And again, people don't have a problem with people they like making money. So if the new HHS secretary writes a book about some scandal that he thinks he's uncovered and he sells it for $19 on Amazon, none of his fans go, "What a greedy SOB. What's this guy
No.
doing trying to make money hand over fist with his books?" Right? They all go, "Thank goodness we have such a powerful whistleblower." No one cares that people like that make money selling books, or nobody cares that they get enormous consulting fees during litigation. Like no, like so. In other words, you don't really care about the influence of money in the process. What you care about is that there are certain people that you don't like for one reason or another. Sometimes justified, in many cases not justified. And so that predetermined bias, you go there's money in the process. It's like it's just inevitable, right? Everyone's got to earn a living, so there's going to be money everywhere. So now you can object to that, but you need to do it across the board. Like consistency dictates that this has to be the rule. But the
And
fact that
if you're going to make a medicine, and you've got to make enough profit to continue to make that medicine, right? Without money, you can't do it, right? And without and that's the part that I think people don't understand. It's a very costly endeavor to not only just go through the R&D, but then build the manufacturing capacity to develop to make enough bulk to get out to the people. And it's got to be high quality. Once again, good manufacturing processes. You got to have high quality, uh, it, you know, reproducible uh, product that you're able to get out to the public, and that requires you have to have enough money to be able to pay for that. The other thing that really interesting to me is that I hear lots of people talking about how companies are so bad and we should just shut them down. And companies provide employment. And employment means you've got people who can pay taxes. And once you got people who can pay taxes, then you can fund your government. The government can't run without an income, right? And so the only way you can keep those regulatory agencies afloat, the only way you can keep, the government afloat is if you have enough people who are employed who pay taxes. And so if you go after industry because you think industry is bad, and you think then that somehow you're going to get your NIH funding to float academia, that's not going to. It's all it's an ecosystem, and they're interdependent on each other. And I think that people underestimate how important industry is for not just getting your great idea off the shelf and into the public, but also keeping society afloat.
and the response to this is really telling and really cynical from a lot of these people, right? When you bring up these points, you say, there's thousands of people employed by the pharmaceutical industry, or, consumer prices are going to go up. They'll turn it around and they'll say, don't use people's well-being or people's income to bolster your crusade to bolster your profit margins. I don't know when he said this, but I saw it over the weekend. Callie Means, one of the two Blunder twins. Casey she was a doctor, or I think she was going to be a doctor. She was at Stanford, and then they have this grift as consultants in the alternative
Wellness.
health space. Wellness, right? Wellness.
A former pharma bro too. I mean, Kelly Means is a former pharma bro. He was a lobbyist. for
Again,
Pharma.
well, right, he's had a conversion experience, so you can trust him
Yeah.
now. But he was at some conference, and someone asked him about, these policies that whole coalition is promoting, raising food prices, and he said, of course, right, this is a food industry talking point. We're not going to allow industry to use food prices to hold the American public's health captive, blah blah blah. And the problem with that is you take a very legitimate concern and you just pin it as an industry talking point. So, like, I'm not a pharma bro. I don't have any financial relationship with the pharmaceutical industry, but I'm a dad and I have to buy groceries every week. So if you're going to start banning all these food dyes and go on this crusade against processed food that's perfectly safe and nutritious in moderation, then that's a problem, dude. It really
Because
bugs me to say that, oh, well, yeah, your food prices are going up. Sorry about that. But, in the name of your health, we're going
and
to
then
make your life more difficult.
more difficult. That's exactly right. And that's coming from a place of complete privilege, right? Coming from a place of, these folks can afford that stuff, right? They can afford to have an all organic, um, you know, chemical free diet, whatever that is, right? While they're scaring everybody. And it's predatory.
Yeah, it's shameful. It's really frustrating. Another example, and we don't have to stay on this too long, but another example that comes to mind. I just learned this from the weekend. There's a gentleman in my church who's a retired aerospace engineer, and he worked for a company out here in California. And years ago, like when they're testing rockets and missiles, like this really advanced technology for the Defense Department and that kind of thing, they run these rockets, but they have to clean them down, and you have to use really potent solvents to do that. And so when you wash them down, there's runoff. And so they had to figure out a way to deal with this. So on their property, they built this enormous, and they knew, by the way, they knew that the EPA and the state agencies were going to get on them at some
Mm-hmm.
point, right? Once
Mm-hmm.
once it became clear that the chemicals they were using could be trouble, they built an artificial lake on their own property. They built this entire system of wells that pumps the polluted wastewater out of this lake. And recycles it. It cleans the water and then recycles it back into their cleaning process. It's really remarkable. They did this all on their own. It's their own engineers. And they did it because they knew the regulators would jump down their
I know.
throats.
Yeah.
And still, to your point about no good deed going unpunished, the state, I believe, came in and they said, you need to shut down this process. So we need to test we need to test how much of this chemical is in this water, and then it's got to go to our predetermined laboratory on the other side of the state. And right, it's this whole bureaucratic process. And the company engineers, they said, look, if you shut this down, these chemicals in the water, they're going to keep accumulating. And when one well fills up, it's going to spill over into the next one. And so pretty soon we're just going to have this whole system that we produced to recycle dirty water completely
Completely
inundated
contaminated.
right. And so the point I'm getting at is regulators come in sometimes with good intentions, and they have this process in mind. They don't fully, to your point earlier, they don't fully understand what they're regulating, but because they have the legal authority, they shut something down, and it actually makes the situation worse because they're not allowing the process to work. And
That's interesting. I've never heard of that case, but that's a very interesting perspective. I do think that once again, things like Operation Warp Speed could really help in make the process much more efficient. But it's so radioactive right now because people are so upset with the whole way COVID was managed. And it's a shame. It's a real shame for cancer patients, right? Specifically, the doubt that's been instilled about mRNA technology is really too bad.
yeah, yeah. I think there would have been way less trepidation and anger had there never been an attempt to mandate the vaccine at the federal level. That was an enormous overreach, and they shouldn't have done it. And that, I think, a lot of the blowback is coming from that. The fact that you were saying, we're going to take away your job unless you get this, your kids can't go to school, you can't go to restaurants, you can't go anywhere, right? Basically, we're going to segregate society on the basis of your vaccination status. And a lot of people get mad at me when I say that, and I don't care. It's like you just can't treat people that way in a civilized society, especially if they haven't done anything wrong yet. Like it's one thing if they don't vaccinate their kids for measles and then their kids start infecting people. You can do contact tracing. You can say, hey, we know that your kid infected this kid who infected this kid. Then you can implement consequences. But you can't just say on a broad scale, if you don't get this shot that is new, it's great. I agree the technology is awesome and it's been pretty well studied. But you can't insist that people that don't have the time to go read clinical trials in the New England Journal of Medicine that they get this and shut their faces. You just can't do that.
I mean, there's also the kind of, you can't also belittle the people who have questions. And I think that the people who had questions got, and I understand where it was coming from. I understand how frustrating it was for doctors who were seeing all sorts of people dying, right? But you got to be patient with people who have questions with a new technology.
Yeah, and they also said that they weren't going to do it. The administration at the time said
They said no, and then they said yes.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. In July, it was that's not our role.
Yeah.
And then by September, October, it was well, of course it's our role. What do you mean? And then they concocted
and they had instilled a lot of doubt in the public anyway. So they, that's the problem. You've got all sorts of politicians getting out there and getting on TV saying it's too rushed and doing all the stuff that instilled doubt, and then all of a sudden those same politicians are like, oh no, it's just fine. That's and it was only to get political points. It was, they could not acknowledge that Donald Trump, for all his foibles, they could not acknowledge that Operation Warp Speed was a success of his. And
it was in spite of him. That's another thing, and it goes both ways. The MAGA people, the MAHA people, they do this too, right? Like if an administration they don't like does something that no one can object to, then they go, well, it was in spite of the people in charge.
That's
it was
exactly
in spite
right.
of these meatheads or these evil doers, whatever.
And the politicization it really destroys public health. It really does.
Yeah. Final thought from me, and then whatever concluding thoughts you have, Liza. But I think it's funny that people, they generally want the regulatory agencies to be involved in more aspects of life, drug development, regulating the labs that produce all sorts of pharmaceutical products, the supply chain, the upstream supply chain that goes into making these products. It's just this massive expansion. If you look at what the EPA did when it was established in the 1970s compared to what it does today, it's in orders of magnitude bigger with bigger budgets, more employees, and so on. And then people turn around and they go, these industries are always talking to the regulatory space. They're always involved with these regulatory agencies. They're always paying them to hire scientists, and they're always talking to them. It's like, well, you create laws that make it so the regulatory agencies are involved in everything, and then you go, why are all these companies involved with it's just weird. It's like you set up the system. Yeah. It's like you set up the system so people do things a certain way. Then they start doing things that certain way, and you go, why are you doing it that certain way? That's not what I meant,
And then you generate so much data, and then they want more data and more data and more data and more data. And pretty soon you're getting data on, stuff that's 50, 60, 70 years old that you have a whole lot of data on. And it's how much data are enough?
Always more.
Yep.
Always more. Okay, maybe we could do another episode because we're getting up on the clock here, but do another episode about what we could do to fix this.
I think that would be a good idea.
Maybe it would be a pipe dream because the things that would fix it are probably not going to happen in our lifetimes.
Yeah,
sadly. But yeah, I hope that maybe sets the table for a discussion you can have with people and just say, I don't know. Like
maybe we could do a space on it and people could brainstorm.
Oh my gosh. I would like that, but at the same time, I wouldn't like that because people are just going to say the weirdest things. I just, like even when we prompt them not to, they still do it. So if you
can't resist.
Yeah. So if you do a space where you go, tell me what you think, they'll be like, okay. So there's these 10 guys in a dark room with cigars. And I'm like, no, stop.
Here we go.
I had a guy tell me, I think it was the week you were gone. He said, "You're a slave, man. You're a slave to pharma. You're a slave." I'm like, okay. Like you clearly follow me closely.
Yeah,
if you know
that Dr. Liza MD makes me say all this stuff.
Yes. Yeah. That's Cam English, slave to big FDA.
Yeah.
Okay. we're done. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back next week. Our spaces are on Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time. All kinds of topics. We're working on it. We've whittled down our choices to two, and we'll have it figured out before Friday. So come join us. They're free. You're allowed to speak your mind. Just don't be a jerk.
That's right.
Follow us on X at Dr. Liza MD. I'm at Cam J English. Genetic Literacy Project puts the show on for us. They are at Genetic Literacy. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.
Bye.